In the silent expanse between forgotten stars, a lone planet drifted through its morning. Long ago, life flourished here, but now, only ashes whispered in the empty streets. Once towering structures leaned like broken sentinels, their surfaces scarred by time and sorrow. The sky hung heavy with a colorless mist, and the ground, littered with relics of happier times, told stories of those who had lived, loved, and perished without witness. Amid the ruins, she remained. Small, fragile, and utterly alone. The last heartbeat on a world no longer meant for the living. Her skin, once radiant with the colors of her people's joy, had faded into pale desolation. Her large, gleaming eyes held oceans of grief no words could capture. Each day blurred into the next, marked only by hunger, fear, and the hope that someone might hear her silent cries. Yet no one came. No voice answered. She wandered the broken city, clutching a tattered piece of cloth once wrapped lovingly around her by arms she could barely remember. Every step was a prayer, every breath a struggle against despair. Memories clung to her like dying embers, a mother's song, a father's embrace, laughter that once filled these now silent streets. Each memory stabbed sharper than any blade, for she knew they would never return. When the first tremors reached her, distant at first and then growing louder, she curled tighter into the shadows. For so long, fear had been her only companion. She had seen the monsters once, things that came not from nightmares, but from the darkest spaces between stars. Her people had hidden, fought, and fallen. Now she waited, trembling, heart hammering, certain that death had finally found her. But what emerged from the swirling dust was not a beast. It was something she had only heard of in half-forgotten stories, whispered by her elders during times of peace, creatures called humans. They stepped cautiously through the ruins, their strange, shining suits gleaming faintly against the gloom. She dared not hope. Hope had betrayed her too many times. Instead, she shrank back, holding her breath, invisible in the ruins of her world. One of them paused, visor catching the dim light, head turning slowly. The humans seemed almost reverent, as if feeling the weight of what had been lost here. She could hear them speaking, their voices low, tense. Words she could not understand, but tones filled with something unfamiliar. Not the cold detachment of those who had destroyed her world, nor the cruel amusement of scavengers who had sometimes picked through the remains. No, this sound carried warmth. Sadness, yes, but also anger. Compassion. She watched, torn between the desperate need to remain hidden and a yearning so deep it hurt. Her frail body shook with the effort of remaining silent, tears gathering unbidden. If they found her, would they finish what the others had started? Would she be another forgotten casualty of a war that had stolen everything from her? A glint caught the nearest human's eye, a shimmer of movement, too small, too subtle for most to notice. Yet somehow they did. Cautiously, gently, they moved closer, no weapons raised. One knelt, lowering themselves to her level, hands open, voice soft as wind through shattered glass. She flinched, shrinking further into the shadows, making herself as small as she could. But the human did not lunge, did not shout. They simply waited, patient as the stars. Minutes, or hours, passed. She lost track, caught between terror and an aching hunger for the warmth they seemed to radiate. Slowly, as if moving through thick water, she uncurled from her hiding place. Her thin fingers gripped the cloth against her chest, her body a map of old bruises and long-healed wounds. The human did not move. From their belt, they carefully removed a small object, a faintly glowing orb, and rolled it gently toward her. She flinched, then watched it with wide, wary eyes. It pulsed with a soft, comforting light, nothing like the burning devastation she remembered. The light was kind. Her tiny hand, trembling violently, reached out. Fingers brushed the orb's surface. Warmth, not searing but embracing, spread through her frozen limbs. Her breath itched, a broken sob escaping her cracked lips. For the first time in what felt like eternity, someone had offered her something without wanting to take anything in return. The human's voice, still low, spoke again, words she could not understand, but the meaning somehow clear. You are safe now. The moment shattered something inside her. Tears streamed freely down her hollow cheeks, her body shaking with sobs too big for her small frame. She had held on to survival with clenched fists, refusing to let go even as the universe abandoned her. Now she surrendered, not in defeat, but in fragile trust. She stumbled forward, collapsing into the human's waiting arms. The embrace was careful, featherlight, as if they feared breaking her further. She pressed her face against the rough material of their suit, breathing in scents unfamiliar yet comforting. Arms wrapped around her, not imprisoning, but shielding, promising without words that she was no longer alone. Above them, the broken sky remained unchanged, and the wind still carried the dust of the fallen. But here, in the hollow shell of a dead world, life stirred again. Fragile. Trembling. Alive. And for the first time in forever, the alien girl wept not from despair, but from the aching, overwhelming hope that maybe, just maybe, she had been found. The journey away from the ruined city was a blur of sensations she struggled to hold onto. Carried gently, cradled against a warm chest, she listened to the human's heartbeat, steady and calm against the terror still howling inside her. Each step they took away from the devastation behind her was a step into a future she couldn't yet imagine. Fear clung to her like a second skin, but every time the tremor of it threatened to take over, the human's hand would gently adjust its hold, reminding her that, for now, she was safe. The world around her changed, slowly at first, from shattered ruins to rocky hills and patches of dry forest clinging stubbornly to life. She noticed things she hadn't dared see before, the way light filtered through cracked clouds, the distant call of some surviving bird-like creature, the coolness of a breeze that didn't stink of death. These details, once meaningless under the weight of survival, now scratched at the walls she had built inside herself, daring her to feel again. When they reached the ship, she recoiled instinctively. The dark hull, the strange noises, the heavy scent of oil and machinery, it all screamed of traps, of violence disguised as salvation. She dug her fingers into the human suit, clinging desperately, refusing to be torn away into another nightmare. But the human didn't force her. They spoke in soothing tones, moving slowly, allowing her to see that no chains waited inside, no cages lurked in the shadows. Only more humans, who stood still, hands raised in open gestures she could sense even without knowing their words. Inside, warmth enveloped her, unnatural and overwhelming. The lights were too bright at first, forcing her to bury her face against the human's chest, but no harsh hands pulled her away. Gentle arms brought her to a small room filled with soft colors and strange shapes she could not name. A blanket, thick and heavy, wrapped around her slight frame. For a moment, she froze, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar kindness. One of the other humans approached, offering something that smelled of food. Her stomach twisted painfully with hunger, but suspicion warred with need. The offering hand remained steady, patient. With shaking fingers, she reached out, snatching the ration and retreating as far into the corner as the room allowed. She devoured the food in frantic bites, tears streaming down her face. Even as she ate, part of her braced for punishment, for the slap or shout that would surely follow. None came. Only silence, broken by soft murmurs that carried no threat. Days passed, or at least, what she thought were days, in a fragile, uncertain rhythm. She watched them, these humans, always wary, always ready to bolt. Yet every interaction was careful, deliberate. They never crowded her. They never shouted. When she cried in her sleep, haunted by images she couldn't escape, a gentle voice would drift to her through the dark, grounding her, reminding her that the past was not reaching for her here. Gradually, she learned to associate sounds with actions. Soft words spoken when food arrived. Murmurs when clean clothes were offered. A particular tone when inviting her to walk outside the small room. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, understanding began to stitch itself into her mind. The humans were not captors. They were rescuers. Helpers. She didn't understand why. She had lived too long under the brutal certainty that no one cared if she lived or died. Yet here they were, proving her wrong with every small, patient act. One day, after a fitful sleep, she awoke to find a human sitting cross-legged near her, holding a small device. Curious despite herself, she crept closer, peering at the images moving across the screen. Pictures of other worlds, vibrant and whole, filled with strange animals, rushing rivers, mountains capped with white, endless fields of green. Worlds that still lived, still laughed. The ache in her chest grew unbearable. She wanted to believe places like that existed. She wanted to believe she might someday walk under a sky that wasn't broken. The human tapped the device gently, offering it to her. Hesitant, she reached out, brushing the screen. New images filled the surface, images of humans smiling, playing, building. There were children, too, smaller versions of the towering figures who now cared for her. Their laughter, captured in frozen frames, was unlike anything she remembered. Pure. Unbroken. She didn't realize she was crying until her vision blurred. The human didn't speak. They simply sat, offering presents instead of demands. It was the first time in longer than she could measure that anyone had allowed her space to feel without trying to fix it, without turning away from her brokenness. The next morning, a small garment lay folded neatly near her bedding, clothes, tiny and strange, stitched together in bright, cheerful colors. She stared at it for a long time before daring to touch it. Her old cloth, once her shield against the empty world, had grown tattered and grim. This new gift seemed almost too precious for someone like her. Still, she gathered it in trembling arms, pressing it against her heart. Later, wearing the new clothes, she ventured farther into the ship. Hallways that had once loomed like threats now felt merely unknown. She caught glimpses of other humans, some giving her small smiles, some offering a wave but never pushing closer. It confused her, this patience, this unspoken respect for her fear. The human who had first found her, whose arms had offered the first safety she'd known in years, became her silent anchor. She watched them work sometimes, hands steady as they repaired damaged equipment, or bent over glowing screens filled with strange symbols. They never forgot her. A nod, a shared piece of fruit, a quick grin, they wove invisible threads between them, tying her slowly to this strange new life. For the first time since the end of her world, she began to imagine a future not written in blood and ash. She didn't know where these humans would take her, or what lay beyond the cold metal walls of the ship. But a seed had taken root inside her heart, fragile and tiny but alive. Hope. The days aboard the human vessel became a tapestry of cautious trust and slow transformation. Every small kindness stitched a new thread into the fragile structure of her spirit. She learned to read the expressions of her rescuers. The soft curve of a smile meant reassurance, the gentle tilt of a head meant a question asked without words, the steady gaze meant she was not invisible anymore. In a world where she had once been forgotten, she was now, astonishingly, seen. One human, the one who had first found her, became the constant sun around which her small world revolved. His presence was never overwhelming, but always near. He didn't demand she learn their language, but when she did try, halting syllables born from broken memories, he met each attempt with a quiet patience that never once made her feel foolish. It was through him that she pieced together their names, their roles, and their mission. They were not conquerors or scavengers. They were rescuers sent by what they called the United States, a place she slowly realized was not a forgotten ruin, but a living, breathing part of a distant world she had never seen. She was introduced, through gestures and fragmented words, to a concept that shook her understanding to its core: family. Not a collection of people bound by necessity or cruelty, but a choice. A deliberate weaving together of lives for the sake of love, loyalty, and belonging. Family was something they offered her, not in words she could understand at first, but through every unspoken act. An extra blanket laid beside her sleeping place. A carefully repaired doll made from scraps of cloth. A laugh shared over a simple meal, the humans allowing her to feel part of their circle without ever forcing her. The ship became a world of its own, floating far above the shattered remains of her old life. Through small, persistent efforts, they taught her that not all futures were soaked in fear. They gave her small responsibilities, tidying her sleeping space, carrying supplies from one room to another, nothing overwhelming, but enough to offer a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she craved. For the first time in her life, she was not surviving hour to hour. She was building something, however fragile, that resembled living. Yet shadows still lingered. Some nights, the terrors of her past would seep through the thin walls she had built inside herself. She would wake gasping, trembling with the certainty that it had all been a cruel trick, that kindness would peel away to reveal the brutal truths she knew too well. On those nights, without fail, the human would sit silently nearby, offering no words she could not understand, only the unshakable presence that kept her from falling back into the abyss. Her understanding of their language grew in fragments, much like a shattered mirror being painstakingly reassembled. She learned the word for sky, for hope, for home. She learned that the human who had saved her was called Daniel, a name that felt heavy with meaning, though she could not yet grasp why. He taught her simple things: how to ask for food, how to say thank you, how to tell someone she was afraid without needing to collapse into silence. Each new word was a victory, a reclamation of a voice she had almost forgotten she possessed. One day, Daniel showed her a small flag, a piece of cloth adorned with stars and stripes, and explained, as best he could, that it represented a place where promises were kept, where even those abandoned by the universe could find a new beginning. She ran her fingers over the fabric, awed by its simplicity and its weight. To her, it was not just a symbol of a distant country. It was proof that somewhere, somehow, someone had decided she was worth saving. Slowly, the walls of the ship began to feel less like a cage and more like a promise. She was invited into the common spaces, encouraged to sit among the crew even if she said nothing. They taught her small games to pass the time, laughing with her instead of at her when she struggled to understand the rules. They treated her not as a burden, but as something precious, something fiercely protected. Despite everything they gave her, she struggled with the invisible scar left behind by abandonment. She still hesitated when a hand was extended in kindness. She still flinched at sudden loud noises, memories of screams and explosions flashing unbidden across her mind. But she was no longer fighting alone. Every small fear that was met with understanding, every trembling step forward that was greeted with patient encouragement, chipped away at the heavy armor she had wrapped around herself for survival. Daniel once knelt before her, holding a small pendant in his callous hands. It was simple, just a silver star on a chain. He didn't push it into her hands but let her choose. She hesitated, the old instincts whispering warnings of hidden traps. But something deeper, something stubborn and yearning, made her reach out and accept it. She wore it tucked close to her heart, an anchor against the storm still raging inside. The ship's crew spoke often of a destination, a place they simply called home. She clung to the word, turning it over in her mind. Could a place like that really exist for someone like her? Someone whose memories were stitched with fire and loss. Daniel promised it did, not with grand speeches but with quiet certainty. When he spoke of it, his voice held a reverence she could feel even without understanding every word. And slowly, unbelievably, she began to believe it too. Home was not just a dream reserved for others. It was something being built for her, one heartbeat, one word, one offered hand at a time. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was healing. And for the first time she could remember, she dared to hope that she would not face the future alone. The first glimpse of Earth was unlike anything she had imagined. Vast oceans swirled with deep blues, continents stretched like sleeping giants beneath veils of cloud, and everywhere, there was color, alive, endless, real. She pressed her hands against the viewing glass, feeling a tremor of awe pass through her. It was overwhelming, not just because of its beauty, but because it existed. A place untouched by the ash and broken stones that had defined her world. A place where maybe, just maybe, she could belong. The descent was filled with unfamiliar sounds and trembling air, but Daniel stayed close, his presence a steady heartbeat she could measure her fear against. When they finally touched the ground, the world smelled different, richer, fuller, as if even the air carried the memory of rain and growing things. She stumbled when she stepped out, her legs still unsure on this living, breathing soil. But no one laughed. No one rushed her. They simply waited, offering her the time and dignity she had been denied for so long. There was a small settlement, not the sprawling cities Daniel had described in fragments, but a quieter place, nestled among rolling fields and crowned with wide, open skies. Wooden homes with windows that glowed warmly at dusk, people who smiled without suspicion, children who ran and shouted without fear. She stayed close to Daniel's side, her fingers clinging to the hem of his jacket until her hands stopped trembling enough to let go. They introduced her to others, some who had faces lined with years of kindness, others young and vibrant, all strangers who greeted her as though she had always been meant to be among them. It made her chest ache with something too large and too new to name. She was given a small room in Daniel's home, walls painted a soft, welcoming color, a bed made with care, a window that opened to the starlit sky. No locks on the door. No harsh commands. Just freedom she didn't yet know how to hold without flinching. Life moved at a gentler pace here. She learned the rhythms of mornings filled with birdsong, afternoons scented with cut grass and baking bread, evenings that closed not in screams but in laughter drifting through open windows. Every day, she learned something new. How to plant a seed and trust that something would grow. How to read simple words written in books too precious to destroy. How to smile back without fear when someone smiled at her first. Daniel never pushed her to speak of her past, but somehow she found herself telling him anyway, in broken words and gestures that filled the gaps language couldn't reach. She spoke of cold nights huddled beneath ruined stone, of voices that once promised safety only to deliver betrayal, of the long, silent hours when she had believed she was the last soul left in a dead world. Daniel listened without interruption, without judgment. When the words ran dry and the weight of memory threatened to crush her, he simply sat nearby, his quiet presence stronger than any wall she had ever hidden behind. Spring came, and with it, a festival unlike anything she had known. The whole town gathered beneath banners of bright color, tables laden with food she could scarcely believe was real. They crowned her with a garland of wild flowers and laughed when she blushed, not with cruelty but with shared joy. She found herself laughing too, tentative at first, then freely, the sound strange and beautiful in her own ears. She danced with the others, clumsy but unashamed, her bare feet finding purchase on ground that welcomed every uncertain step. The nightmares came less often now. When they did, she had somewhere to run besides the empty echoes of her mind. She would wake in terror, only to find a light left burning for her in the hallway, a cup of warm tea waiting on the kitchen table, a blanket already laid out beside Daniel's old armchair. No demands. No shame. Just quiet understanding. It was these small things, more than grand promises or declarations, that stitched her broken pieces back together. One evening, as they sat watching the stars creep across the sky, Daniel handed her a small book with pages worn soft from use. It was a journal, he explained, a place for memories she chose to keep, not the ones forced upon her. Trembling, she turned the first page and stared at the blankness, terrified by its emptiness, but also, for the first time, excited by its possibility. This was hers to fill, however she chose. A life not dictated by fear or loss, but shaped by hope. She wrote carefully at first, simple words she had labored to learn: safe, family, home. Then came longer sentences, messy but determined, capturing the slow, incredible truth growing inside her. She was not just surviving anymore. She was living. She was becoming someone she had never dared to imagine she could be. As the seasons changed, so did she. Strength replaced frailty. Curiosity bloomed where fear had once rooted deep. The town welcomed her more with each passing day, not because she was a symbol or a project, but because she was herself, a soul who had weathered unimaginable storms and still found a way to reach for the light. In a land where no one had known her name, she became something more than a survivor. She became a part of the story written into the soil, the rivers, the endless skies above. Not an alien. Not an outsider. Simply a girl who had found a family willing to hold her close until she could stand on her own. And standing there beneath the endless stars, wrapped in the gentle hush of a world reborn, she finally understood. She was not abandoned. She was not forgotten. She was home. The years passed quietly, marked not by the sharp scars of survival but by the soft, enduring marks of living. She grew stronger, her voice steadier, her eyes no longer filled with the haunted distance of someone expecting every kindness to be a trap. In the simple moments, picking apples in the autumn sun, sitting by the fire weaving stories from the old stars, she built a life far from the ruins of her past. Yet deep inside, there remained a thread of sadness, thin but unbreakable, stitched through her soul. It wasn't sorrow for what had happened to her, but for all those who had never been given the chance to heal the way she had. Daniel aged, the lines of his face deepening, his hair losing its color strand by strand, but the kindness in his eyes never dimmed. He treated her not like someone he had saved, but like someone he had been honored to know. Their bond, forged in fear and sorrow, became something profound, something neither of them could fully explain to others who asked. She was not his daughter by blood, nor he her father by any decree, but in every way that mattered they were family. One winter, when the snows came early and fierce, Daniel fell ill. She stayed at his side, refusing to leave even when the doctors said there was little they could do. She remembered the way he had once stayed close to her when nightmares clawed at her mind, and she returned that silent loyalty now, holding his hand through every painful breath. In the quiet hours of the night she read to him from the journal he had given her, the one he had once insisted she fill with her own stories, her own memories, her own hope. Her voice trembled as she read, but she didn't stop. She told him about her first spring planting, about the day she learned to swim in the river with the other children, about the nights they spent mapping constellations she had never known existed. And he listened, even when his body grew too weak to respond. His eyes remained open, drinking in every word, every sign that she had not just survived, but thrived. When he finally closed his eyes for the last time, he did so with a faint smile. Not one of regret, but of quiet pride. She wept, cradling his hand against her heart, mourning not with the shattering despair of losing the last anchor to her life, but with the deep, bittersweet gratitude of having ever been loved so fiercely. The town gathered to honor him, and for the first time, she stood among them not as a silent observer but as someone who belonged. She spoke briefly, her words halting but clear, telling them how Daniel had saved her not by taking her away from a ruined world, but by giving her the choice to live in a better one. In the days that followed, she wandered the fields where he had once walked, feeling the weight of his absence in every familiar place. But grief did not drive her into silence. Instead, it called her forward. Daniel had taught her to build a life from the broken pieces. Now it was her turn to offer that gift to others. She began helping the newcomers, the broken, the scared, the ones who arrived with haunted eyes and shaking hands. Not all were like her. Some were human children displaced by war, others refugees from distant colonies or shattered dreams. But pain, she learned, wore different faces, and hope could be offered in the same simple ways Daniel had offered it to her: a warm meal, a safe place to sleep, a hand reached out without expectation. Word spread beyond the small settlement. Stories traveled of the young woman who welcomed the forgotten and the lost, who spoke of stars and survival and kindness in the same breath. They came in greater numbers, not because she promised miracles, but because she offered something rarer, a place where no past mistake, no mark of suffering, could ever outweigh the simple fact of being alive. One evening, much like the night she had first seen Earth, she stood on the hill overlooking the valley, the grass whispering at her feet. The stars shone bright above her, cold and eternal. She clutched a small pendant at her neck, a keepsake left behind by Daniel, and whispered a promise into the wind. She would not forget where she had come from. She would not forget those who had been abandoned, as she once was, those whose silent cries had gone unheard across the void. She would be the answer to their loneliness. She would be the hand she had once needed and the voice she had once longed for. In a universe too often indifferent to suffering, she would be a constant, stubborn refusal to let despair win. When a new child arrived that winter, shivering with more fear than cold, she wrapped them in a blanket and pressed a cup of warm tea into their hands. She didn't ask their story. She didn't need to. She saw it in their eyes, the same hollow, aching need she had once carried like a second skin. She sat beside them, silent but present, offering her presence the way Daniel once had, patiently, steadfastly, endlessly. Later, when the child fell asleep with their head resting against her arm, she looked up at the stars once more. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the staggering beauty of what Daniel had given her, the chance not just to survive, but to become something more, something that could not be erased by fear or loss or time. She was no longer the girl abandoned and forgotten in a dead world. She was the voice that answered back across the silent dark. She was the heart that beat fiercely against the coldness of the stars. And she was home, forever, in every life she touched.